Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. When I worked in the corporate sector, there was an idea that was often thrown around. The idea was this: hope is not a strategy. There may have been some truth to that notion. Hope in the absence of clearly delineated tactics is not a great recipe for success. And yet, hope is essential to so much of how we function in life. And it's not simply that the absence of it is a hallmark of depression, but there may actually be strategic uses to it after all. How can we use hope as a tool? How can it propel us toward greater outcomes and greater resilience? For this episode, we have an expert look at these questions and many others related to improving our lives. Dr. David B. Feldman is the McCarthy Professor of Counseling Psychology at Santa Clara University. He has authored 3 books, most recently Super Survivors: The Surprising Link Between Suffering and Success. His research has been published in numerous scientific journals, as well as in popular publications including Self, the Oprah Magazine, Time, and the Harvard Business Review. He has appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Network, MSNBC, and National Public Radio, among others. In addition, he is the host of the Psychology in 10 Minutes podcast, which can be found at psychologyin10minutes.com or through any podcast app. So join Dave and me as we do a deep dive into the science of hope. Dr. David Feldman, welcome to Super Psyched.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, since you and I know each other quite well, I'm going to be referring to you as Dave moving forward, but please know that you have my greatest respect as an academic, as a researcher, and as a clinician, as well as a radio personality, among other things that you do.
Well, it's a good thing Dave's my name.
Otherwise, we'd really be in trouble. Yeah. So, Dave, you have done extensive research on hope, and one of my favorite quotes in life has been, particularly in the corporate realm, is that hope is not a strategy. And yet there may be some truth to the idea that hope actually can be a strategy. I was wondering, can hope be used as a strategy?
Well, I think in a way, hope is the mother of all strategies. So if I could take a second to just tell you how psychologists think about what hope is, maybe it'll clarify why I say that. So the sort of model of hope, or the definition of hope, that I've been working with for the last 20 years and that has a lot of research on it is what's known as hope theory. Or you can also think of it as, and I often call it, a model called grounded hope. And it really consists of 3 pieces. And this comes from the work of one of the fathers of positive psychology by the name of C.R. Snyder. And he did a really interesting year-long research project 30 years ago, where he went to leaders in his community. These were business leaders and church leaders and government leaders, educational leaders, and he asked them, using whatever definition of hope they wanted. He didn't give them a definition because he wanted to see what they do. He said, please just give me a list of the names of all of the most hopeful people you know. And then over the next year, he interviewed all the people on that long list who would talk to him. And he discovered that all of those very hopeful people seemed to share 3 things in common. And Snyder called these the 3 components of hope. But I actually think one really useful way of thinking about them is to think of them as the 3 conditions for hope to thrive. And it turns out all these hopeful people have these 3 conditions set in their lives. And these are kind of no-duh conditions. They're things we all know we should do, and yet I think we can agree that very often things that we know we should do, we don't do. So the first one is having goals. so the first condition for hope to thrive is having something to hope for. And we know from now 30 years of research since that people who feel more hopeful and are more successful, by the way, tend to have a variety of goals in different areas of their life. So they tend to kind of diversify their goal portfolio. And they tend to be goals that are truly meaningful to them. And we can talk more about, what that would look like if you want. The second condition for hope to thrive is having pathways. So a pathway is just a fancy word for a strategy or a plan that can get you from where you are to your goals. And it turns out that people who were on that hopeful list not only had kind of a vague sense of their plans, but if you asked them, they could close their eyes and give you a very detailed articulation of how they were going to get to most of the goals in their lives. And not only that, they tended to have backup plans in case their first plans were blocked. So the level of concreteness and detail was there. And then the third condition for hope to thrive is what Snyder called agency. But it's basically just a fancy word for motivation or energy. And so these folks all could identify, where did they get their motivation from? What were those sources of motivation in their life? Was it their family? Was it their spirituality? Was it physical fitness and their physical energy? Was it the way that they talked to themselves and the messages that they gave to themselves? And so, in a way, this is a strategy for life, right? Making sure that we all have these three conditions, goals, pathways, and agency, set in our lives. And I could add, like I said, it's the mother of all strategies, because I think any strategy in our lives starts with these three conditions, right?
Yeah, for sure. Goals, pathways, and agency, they seem like non-negotiables in terms of moving forward and actually increasing the likelihood of success.
And yet so often we don't do them, right? How many times do we have like a dream or a desire, and that's kind of where it stops.
Right.
And so I think one of the things we all can do is to think of these not as negotiables, right? But as you said, as non-negotiables, as conditions that we can intentionally and effortfully set in our lives. Hope doesn't have to be amorphous. We know the conditions that bring it on, and these are them.
Right. And it's what I love that you were kind of alluding to, is that there's a chasm between what we know and what we do. It's almost like things are simple and people kind of roll their eyes and say, duh, and yet they're not easy to execute on the daily. And it seems that the difference maker is executing on the daily as much as we possibly can. Is that consistent with your experience?
I think that's right. And I don't mean to pretend that it's easy to set those conditions for hope to thrive. I mean, it takes real effort. And sometimes, because I've been involved in developing a kind of therapy called hope therapy, or sometimes it's also called the hope workshop or the hope enhancement intervention. And, we use a lot of worksheets. We use a lot of sheets of paper, to get people to really map out what maybe say the next 6 months or the next year of their life would look like. A simple intervention, right, is to draw a little stick figure of you on the left of a page, and on the right of the page, write one of your goals. And then along a timeline in between to put those steps along your pathway. And not only to stop there, but to then say, well, below those steps, what are the ways that each of those steps could be blocked? Because life throws us curveballs, right? And then even to not even stop there and to go one step further, and below that to write how we're going to get around each of those blockages. And this isn't romantic work. It's not something that's as fun as simply daydreaming about, when we get that great job, or when we get a raise, or when we start that new hobby, or whatever it happens to be. But this is the kind of work that will ultimately get us there. And this is also the kind of work that fuels your hope, because I guarantee you, if you did an exercise like that on a daily or weekly or even monthly basis, that when you walked away from that exercise, you'll feel more hopeful. And we also know from research that I've done and that others have done with me, that will actually raise your chances of moving towards your goals, of actually accomplishing them.
Yeah, there was in no way, shape, or form did you make it sound like it was easy. So, yes, I really get it that this is hard stuff to do. And I like that you kind of contrast between the hope that is the grounded version that Dr. Snyder so profoundly studied and gave as a legacy to his life, that we still reap the benefits of, especially since the absence of hope is a hallmark of depression. I love also that you made kind of a distinction between grounded hope in the way that Dr. Snyder describes it, as opposed to perhaps daydreaming, to which the idea of hope not being a strategy might more be accurate.
Well, and we can even go further, because I think that not all daydreaming is created equal. So,
good point.
There is grounded daydreaming, and then there is fantasy-based daydreaming. So what I mean by grounded hope is a hope that is grounded in reality. We are recording this right now in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and the reality is pretty horrible and stark. A best case scenario for people is that they're able to keep their job, but they're sheltering in place at home. They may be bored, or they may be overly busy. They may have conflicts with their family. They may be forced to go to work if they're considered necessary personnel and feel that their livelihoods, their lives, and the health of their families is at risk. Some people, of course, have lost their jobs and are facing huge financial losses. And of course, other people have lost people that they love. And it would be easy to say, well, this is a hopeless situation.
Yep.
And I think in one sense, I would agree with that. If you're using hope as a synonym for positive, right? It's not a positive situation. And yet I think, in fact, it's a pretty negative, pretty awful situation. And yet I think that it is possible to have grounded hope in that situation. And what that means is that we all need to kind of look at our lives and ground ourselves in the reality of what we cannot change. It's sort of like the Serenity Prayer. We need to look at our lives and say, you know what? These are the things about this situation that I can't change. I can't bring back a loved one who's died. I can't necessarily get back a job that I've lost. I can't, if I'm sheltering in place alone, I can't be with others that I love right now. And that's the grounded part of grounded hope. And then the hope part is saying, all right, what can I build on top of that? So given that reality that I can only accept and grieve, and that's hard work, by the way, I can then ask the question, well, what's next? What is the goal that I want to set for my life now? Are there pathways that will get me there? And how can I keep myself motivated? And so hope takes work, but it is possible, grounded hope is possible, even in really difficult situations. Now, it's also possible to have a grounded daydream. In fact, the hope intervention that I've developed and have published a few articles on actually involves something that you could call grounded or structured or hopeful daydreaming, where we actually ask participants to close their eyes and not to fantasize about how great it'll be when all their dreams come true, but instead to envision in a very effortful way, what is the goal that I want? And each step along the way to that goal, and getting around each obstacle that may stand in the way, and eventually getting to their goal, sort of like practicing in your mind, in the same way that a basketball player, for instance, might practice in his or her mind shooting hoops, and we know that improves sports performance.
Yes.
Well, that kind of structured visualization, it turns out, also nurtures hope and actually increases goal achievement and does all kinds of other things. Like, we have some evidence that it can play a role, at least, in decreasing depression, decreasing anxiety, making life seem more meaningful, etc.
Oh, David, I love that idea. And wondering about what types of practices might people engage in leveraging the research to engage in that type of grounded daydreaming, not just during COVID, because hopefully after COVID, people will be listening to this as well. But how
Sure.
might people really leverage grounded daydreaming, grounded hope in a daily type of practice that might improve their lives?
So I think it starts with just thinking about those three conditions for hope to thrive in your life and taking your hope temperature, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So, and taking your temperature in each of those areas. So ask yourself, how are you doing in terms of goals? Do you have goals that are truly meaningful in your life? Most of us, most of the time, the goals we are working on in our daily lives are sort of goals we have to do, right? I mean, I have to do my laundry, otherwise I won't have clean clothes to wear. And,
right.
I have to go to work, or at least these days telecommute to work, otherwise I won't have a paycheck.
Yep.
If I'm lucky enough to have a job. I have to do certain things for my boss. I have to do certain things for my family. And I'm not knocking that. I mean, it's really great to fulfill your obligations. But I think it's also really important for hope to thrive, to have at least one goal that's really personally important to you, meaningful to you, even if it's small, even if it's a hobby you've been meaning to start up, or if it's, my goal today is to call a friend that I haven't talked to in a long time, or maybe it's a business you wanted to start up on the side. So really checking in and taking your temperature. Where am I in terms of my goals? But you can do the same thing for the other two elements of hope, pathways and agency. So look, if you've got great goals, check in with yourself and ask yourself, what's the status of my pathways? Do I believe that there's a way that's going to get me to those goals? And if you don't, there are some things we can talk about that can help you. One way is you can sit down and map out your goal, like we talked about a minute ago, and actually make a step-by-step map and really think through intentionally what are the steps and what are the obstacles that might get in my way and how am I going to get around those obstacles. But other things that you can do is go on the internet and read stories of people who have had similar goals and how they succeeded. There are lots of successful people who have written essentially articles about, what helps me to succeed. Read those. Try to absorb those. If you know someone who's a particularly good planner, so for me, I'm lucky. It's my dad. And I'm still lucky enough to have him in my life. And so I can call him, and he'll help me break down the goal and make plans. So there are lots of things you can do to raise your pathways temperature. And then finally, take your agency temperature. How's your motivation levels? Where's your energy? And if your energy and your motivation is low, try to figure out where that's coming from. Are you not getting enough sleep? How's your diet? Are you exercising? So your physical agency, but also emotional and mental agency. Do you have cheerleaders in your life? And if you don't, who can be a cheerleader for you? Can you find people to support you in your work? I find that a lot of times people have folks in their life who are willing to cheerlead for them. They just don't open themselves up to that kind of support. And then finally checking in about your psychological or cognitive agency. What are your thoughts like? Are you telling yourself you can't do it? Or are you telling yourself that maybe it's possible? There's a big difference between those two. And so kind of working on the way you think about your goals as well provides agency. So that's just a smattering of ideas. And all that comes from these sort of hope therapy interventions that I've been working on for the last 15 years or so.
Oh, Dave, that's so rich, and you've thrown out so many good ideas. I'm wondering about the idea of finding cheerleaders. That was kind of your third point. I love that idea, and that some people might be a little bit reluctant to opening themselves up to pursuing that. Can you describe the stumbling blocks between asking for cheerleading and what are the obstacles there?
Well, there are so many. I think people are shy about reaching out for help. Let me give you a concrete example. So clinically, for several years, I worked with people who were dying of cancer, of heart disease, of a variety of chronic and very serious illnesses, and their families. And a lot of times I would work with the caregivers, and oftentimes, I'm sure as you know, in our society, it's often older adults who are caring for older adults, right? So it might be a 70, 75, 80-year-old. Often it's the woman, because women live a little longer than men, who might be caring for her, equally aged husband. And that's overwhelming, all the tasks that she would have to do. And I've suggested to people for years, why don't you reach out and ask for help from friends, from family, from your kids, from whoever is there. And oftentimes I hear people say, no, I don't want to be a burden. And even if I did reach out for help, nobody would really be there for me. Or they really believe that it's too burdensome to ask for help. And so I've been doing a little intervention with folks for years where I say, well, let's put that thought on hold for a second, and let's just make a menu of helpers. Let's write down on the left-hand side of a sheet of paper all those people that could potentially help you in your life, even if only in small ways. And then along the right-hand side, let's write what kind of help they can give. Because my experience is that if you ask people for help, for assistance, for support, and it's something that they're not very good at doing, they won't do it. But if you ask them for something that they're good at doing, that's easy for them, they usually will do it and will actually feel pretty good about it. And so, for instance, if you ask somebody for monetary support, but they don't have any money to loan, you're not going to get it. But if you ask that same person maybe to just listen and empathize, and maybe they're a very compassionate person, you might get that. But there might be another person in your life who's terrible at listening and empathizing. But that person might be able to give you some kind of actual instrumental support. They might be able to take you out to a movie or cheer you up, or they might be able to give you money or resources. And so I think it's the same for any goal in our lives. Make that menu of helpers and only ask people for things that you believe they really can easily provide. And then test that out. I might be totally wrong, but see if this doesn't work and see if that changes your view of opening yourself up to support.
Dave, I love that you brought up the idea that people worry that they might be burdensome to others, and yet we also have concrete evidence that when people are called upon to offer the best parts of themselves, of course, you spoke to the idea of asking people for where they are strong. We have evidence that people feel good when they give. Is that consistent with what you've come across?
Yeah, no question. So there's a lot of research that shows that one of the ways that we all can make ourselves happier in our lives and more satisfied with our lives is through helping. That this is one of the most satisfying activities that any of us can do. In fact, there's that research that shows that money doesn't entirely buy happiness, that money kind of raises your happiness level. The more you make, the happier you are, up to kind of a cutoff point, which is kind of the point at which you have enough money to live and not have to worry. So in the United States, I think the research shows that's around $70,000 annual income. But after that, money doesn't buy you any more happiness, except with one big exception. If you spend that money on other people or giving to charity. In this case, having more money does continue to buy happiness. not because the money is important in itself, but because you're using it for others. And I think we can extend that reasonably to any kind of help we give to others, right? We receive an enormous amount of satisfaction. I know I do from helping other people. The key is that it has to be help that we can provide, that we feel we're good at, that uses our gifts well.
Yeah. I've heard that it's, considered a good deed in some religions to allow another to be of service because it allows them to feel useful. And I'm just wondering, do you have any insight as to why it is that humans feel so compelled to serve and to be useful?
It's a good question. I don't think it's a question that any of us can answer for sure, based on any kind of science or research. It's bound to be speculation. I think one of the reasons is we're evolved that way, right? In the mists of time, I think the human species has been around for, in its present form, for about 150,000 years. I think we've been speaking and having language and art and things like that for about 50,000 years. And if you go back, we evolved to live in tribes with our 30 best friends and family.
Right.
And so, and we were evolved to think of those people in our tribe as family. And we're evolved to sacrifice for them. Why? Because if we sacrifice for them and they sacrifice for us, that's our best bet at surviving and being happy and being successful. And since we're talking about evolution, passing on our genes, right?
Yep.
That's what evolution is about. But we all are the beneficiaries of our ancestors, generations of our ancestors who have passed on that characteristic to us. And so we get great satisfaction from helping others. And it works, doesn't it? I mean, if you look at all of the primate species, my understanding is some evolutionary scientists call the human being the friendly primate, the cooperative primate. We're the species that is most likely to cooperate with each other. Not to say we don't sabotage each other, we're not cruel to each other. We are. But we also have this legacy of cooperation and love and respect. And I think a good life, at least in part, is characterized by that.
Well, you've authored that's such wonderful. I think your speculation feels consistent with my own sense of things. So, at the very least, you have one guy over in this corner thinking that sounded like a very good answer. You have authored many books, and I particularly enjoyed Super Survivors. I've given it to many family members, to many of the people who see me in my office, and everyone has loved it. And the book takes stories of people who've overcome really tough challenges, and through it you share some great principles of the science of resilience. I was wondering, how did you decide to write that wonderful book?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I've done research on a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth for many, many years. And I'm going all the way back to when I was in college and in graduate school. I did my master's thesis, I think, or was it my doctoral dissertation on post-traumatic growth and how people make meaning after trauma. And in a nutshell, the idea of post-traumatic growth is that even though people, of course, in the aftermath of serious traumas and losses and illnesses, people suffer mightily. I mean, there is, just to be clear, there is nothing good or positive about, seeing your house destroyed in an earthquake, or finding out somebody you love has COVID, or losing someone that you love, or being shot at in a war zone, or being victimized by someone. These are the most horrible things that I can imagine. But the research shows, and it's an amazing fact, that something like between 60 to 80%, depending on the study and the kind of trauma, of people in the aftermath of serious traumas grow in some way. Now, that doesn't mean they don't suffer,
Sure.
but they also can grow, and that includes, simple things like seeing the sky as bluer, the grass is greener, and, really finding out who your friends are and deepening your relationships. It can be spiritual things like deepening in your sense of spirituality or your relationship with God or the divine or whatever you believe in. It can be dramatic things like moving across the world, changing careers. We interviewed people for the book Super Survivors that had done things like, founded NGOs to help people who had been through similar things to themselves, spoken for the UN, started important organizations. One of our folks gave up his lucrative career to become a priest because he discovered that spirituality was so important to him. And so people grow and change in the aftermath of trauma, and that's something called post-traumatic growth. And so that was really inspiring to me and my co-author, and we wanted to write a book not only going into the science, because there's something like 30, 40 years of science about this and the factors that help people to do that, but we also wanted to tell some stories because I think, you're a psychologist, one of the best ways to learn from people who have done extraordinary things is to learn their stories.
Right.
Modeling really works, right? And so we wanted to offer some inspiring stories that would actually demonstrate how people did that.
I'm wondering, from all of the insight that you gained from Super Survivors and this, perhaps to many listeners who haven't heard of the idea of post-traumatic growth, I'm wondering how could this be applied to the average person who may not have lived through, say, a horrible war, but has lived through something pretty bad, and what might they? How might they leverage some of the incredible gleanings from your work?
Well, let me first say that we all have traumas in our lives, and the people we interviewed for this book had really serious traumas. I think about one of the people we interviewed, a guy named Alan Locke, who he's British, and he had always had a dream of being in the British Royal Navy. And when he was 25 years old, he achieved his dream, and he was serving as a sailor aboard a destroyer in the Atlantic. And one day he noticed that he couldn't see very well. And he went to the doctor, and he found out, again, in his mid-20s, that he had macular degeneration and would essentially go blind. And, of course, this threw him into great turmoil. But I'm going to fast forward. About a decade later, he becomes the first blind person to row a rowboat across the Atlantic Ocean. And he now holds a record in the Guinness Book of World Records and has been an inspiration to millions of blind and low-sighted people across the globe. And so although, in a way, losing his sight really his world in various ways. He lost his dream of being in the Royal Navy. He lost his commission. It crushed him. He also was able to find a way of not only bouncing back, but bouncing forward. So there are these inspiring stories, and I think the temptation is to say, well, there's something really special about Alan Locke.
Yeah.
And there's nothing special about me. Whether it's I haven't had a trauma like his, or whether it's imagining that he has some kind of special personality that I don't have. And Alan would be the first person to tell you, and in fact, all of the people we interviewed for this book, and I think we tell 17 different stories, all of them said, I'm not special. All of them said, please tell your readers that I'm an ordinary person, and that anyone, regardless of whether they've been through something horrible or not, can accomplish the kinds of things I accomplish. And frankly, it goes back to that grounded hope thing. What we found time and time again is that these survivors had a real sense of grounded hope, grounding themselves in the reality of what's happened to them, but then continuing to look forward and say, well, what now? What's the next step in my life? And I also want to say one more thing, just so people don't get the wrong idea. Not everybody grows in the aftermath of trauma, and that's okay. I don't believe, and none of the super survivors we interviewed for our book, and my co-author doesn't believe either, that if you don't grow after a trauma, that somehow makes you less than someone who does. It's pretty amazing to just get through a trauma and get back to your life the best you can. And yet I think it's really instructive for all of us to learn from these people who have grown in traumatic ways. And some of the principles that they use are grounded hope. Another one is forgiveness. It turns out, we have a chapter on forgiveness, that finding ways of forgiving the people who perpetrated against you your trauma predicts growth. And that's a touchy and difficult subject that I don't know. I still don't know exactly how people do it, although we'll tell you how they do it in our book. But it still amazes me. We talk about social support, which you and I have already talked about being a huge component. We talk about how thinking in certain kinds of positive ways is also a good idea, but not false positive. Right, but a sort of realistic style of positive thinking.
Not deluding yourself.
There's lots of different principles here.
Yeah. You speak about forgiveness and how hard that is to do. And I think of one of our colleagues, Dr. Fred Luskin, who wrote a great book on forgiveness, and he actually directs the Forgiveness Project over at Stanford University. He describes forgiveness as being not an act for the other person whom you're forgiving, but rather it's a selfish act. It's for you. And I think that's a really important piece to consider. I also, Dave, I just wanted, since we do respond so well to modeling, I'm wondering if you would be so kind as to divulge a time, just how grounded hope, or how some of the information you gained from super survivorship, how has that fueled your life? Is there a time in your life that it's somehow one of these two things, or both, really catapulted you out of something?
Sure. Well, let me actually start by sharing with you a story from our book. It's the story that impacted me the most. And it directly relates to the idea of forgiveness that you were talking about a moment ago, which is forgiveness being a gift to yourself. And I think it'll also answer your question about how something in that book has really changed the way I do life. So this is the story of Clementine Wamaraya. And Clementine actually just recently wrote a book of her own called, I think it's called The Girl Who Smiled Beads, I think is what it's called. And it tells a great deal of the story I'm about to share. So she and her sister Claire, I think she was maybe 6 years old at the beginning of this story. Her sister was just slightly older than her, and they were living in Kigali, Rwanda. And this was about 30 or so years ago, a little less than 30 years ago, I believe. And you'll recall that there was a genocide that occurred there. And she was at the time staying with her grandparents in their home. And she remembers late one night hearing men singing and laughing coming down the street towards her grandparents' house. And as they were singing, there were screams in the background. And what was happening is they were taking, I guess, hatchets or knives and machetes, and they were murdering people along the road and going into their houses and murdering people systematically along the way to her grandparents' house. And her grandparents, knowing what was coming, pushed Clementine and Claire out the rear window and said, "Run." And so they did. They ran into a grove of trees as fast as they could. And at some point, Clementine looked back and saw her grandparents' house burning to the ground. And so this was the day that she was sure that she had lost everyone except for her sister in the world that she loved. And for the next, I think it was 6 or 7 years, they bounced these two young girls from UN refugee camp to refugee camp. And these are, I mean, thank heavens the UN establishes these camps, right? But they're pretty horrible places. They're
Right.
filled with disease, and they're filled with poverty, and they're filled with rape and lots of victimization. They're pretty awful places. And
Sure.
and Clementine is hesitant to even talk about a lot of the things that took place in those refugee camps. Well, eventually, fast forward 6 or 7 years, she and her sister Claire are sponsored to come to the United States, and she was then adopted by an American family, or fostered by an American family, I believe. Now, fast forward 25 or so years, she becomes a graduate of Yale. She's now speaking for the UN about the dangers of genocide. It's, of course, still ongoing in many places in the world. She won an essay competition on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and she now works alongside Oprah at the Superstars Leadership Academy for Girls in South Africa. She's starting her own NGO. She's written a book. She's amazing. And we asked her when we were writing the book, how did you do that? And her answer was forgiveness. And I just remember thinking, no way. Like, how can you forgive people for genocide, for murdering the people that you love? Now, it so happens that her parents survived, and she's reunited with them much later, but her grandparents did not, it's my understanding. And how could you possibly forgive people for that? And she said, look, she said it very similar to what you said. She said, the kind of forgiveness I mean is not what most people think of. She said, forgiveness isn't a gift you give to the perpetrator. She doesn't even know who her perpetrators are, right? They're this nameless, faceless band of murderers. But she said, forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. I love the saying, forgiveness is giving up the hope that you can change the past, right?
So good. Yes.
Giving up the hope that the past could be any different. And she said that it was only when she realized she doesn't have a time machine, she can't change the past, she can't get her family back, and she really grieved that she could then turn her sights towards the future and ask, again, that very hopeful question, what's next? What do I want to do now? And she said it was that forgiveness, that breaking of the bond that connected her with this horrible past, that breaking of the psychological bond that enabled her to move forward and do the great things that she did. So I think about that a lot in my life.
I can see why
and
you
I
would.
think about how unforgiveness keeps, because I can hold grudges, don't get me wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And grudges and unforgiveness keeps me prisoner. It doesn't hurt the person who wronged me. It hurts me. And so I try to approach my relationships with a kind of equanimity and realize that I can't always control what happens. But to the best of my ability, and I'm not pretending it's easy, I try to accept what has occurred and move forward with hope and forgiveness in my heart. And that's hard to do, but it's something I strive to do all the time.
That's wonderful. And it just kind of goes back to that idea of the chasm between what we know and what we do. And you are really trying to, I often refer to it as hitting Control-Alt-Delete and overriding the inclination or the system that would ordinarily lead us to do what we ordinarily do and to take on a new behavior so that it can become a habit over time. So I just tip my hat to you for that. I'm sure that your physical and mental health are both benefiting hugely from this intention.
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, there is loads of research that shows that bearing grudges actually raises our risk of heart disease and heart attack and
Right.
elevated blood pressure, and I think stomach ulcers and arthritis and back problems and headaches. I mean, there's a ton of research on this, and I'm not pretending that forgiveness is easy, and I'm certainly not saying that anyone has to forgive. I mean, you cannot, nor should you ever try to force anyone to forgive. I mean, right? Trying to force someone to forgive is basically just re-victimizing them. It's wronging them again. People forgive when and only if they're ready. But for people who are ready, the research shows it's generally a good move. And I try to remember that in my life.
You know, I'm thinking about the opposite for a second, and that is how addicting righteous indignation can be, and anger, and how dopaminergic in terms of the dopamines just circulating in the presence of this anger and righteous indignation, and how we can also fuel the fires of it on social media and really just go there for a long period of time where it becomes pretty hardwired. And the only dance step we begin to know is that, have you seen the opposite of what you are describing now?
Oh, sure. I mean, we were talking about evolution a few minutes ago, right? And how we're kind of hardwired to affiliate with other people and to love other people and even to help other people. But the flip side of that is we're also hardwired to experience anger and to experience the fight or flight or flee response, or fight, flight, or freeze response, right? Yep. It turns out anger is a very helpful emotion. And let me tell you what I mean.
Sure.
Anger protects us. I mean, the reason we are programmed genetically to experience anger is that, our ancient relatives, hundreds of thousands of years ago, right, who were able to feel anger, were able to defend themselves better against attackers. And that helped save their lives in their difficult world and dangerous world that they lived in. And so emotions like anger and anxiety are actually helpful to a certain degree, right?
Right?
So there's actually research that shows that a little appropriate, judiciously placed anger can help to accomplish our goals. There was a research study where they had participants, and I think these were college students, come into a lab, and they were seated in front of a computer where they had a chat window. And they were told that on the other side of the chat, in another room, was another participant, just like them. And that each of them had a different role. The real participant's role was to try to sell a case of mobile phones, to pretend that you're a salesperson,
Sure,
and to sell a case of mobile phones, the highest amount possible.
Right.
And the other person in the other room, their job was to try to buy that case at the cheapest amount possible.
Right.
And the more you were able to sell the case for, the more reward you would get in the real world after the experiment. Well, little did the participants know that on the other side of the chat window, the supposed buyer was an actor.
Right.
And what the research found was when that actor/buyer expressed anger through that chat window, acted like they were angry, the participant sold the mobile phones at 30% less
Wow.
than when the actor/buyer acted like they were not perturbed. And so I think about that when I have to call, AT&T or Verizon or one of these places because my bill was just raised. And I think about, like, if I appropriately and assertively express just a little anger, I'm actually likely to accomplish my goal of getting my bill changed more.
Sure.
Of course, there's a big difference between experiencing anger and acting on it appropriately
Yes.
and being violent, right? Being violent insulting people, slandering people, attacking people. There's no place for this and is just negative and inappropriate. And yet, you're right. This otherwise good tendency to experience anger, which can be helpful in measured amounts in our lives, can be addictive. It can take over. And so I think we all need to kind of like put a little bit of a limiter on that and assure ourselves that anger is okay. It's okay to feel anger, but we need to really think about how we act on it.
And I love the word judicious. I was thinking the exact word, Dave, judicious in the context.
Think alike, right?
Yeah, I'm very complimented in this moment. Dave, one of the reasons that you and I even met is because of our shared love of positive psychology. And it's my understanding that right now you are in the midst of writing a book that is all about positive psychology. And I'm wondering, have you come across anything in the literature that has caused you great delight that the listener might be able to share, at least in the delight and possibly in the application?
Oh, gosh, there is so much that causes me great delight. I think one of the things, so I'm writing a textbook in positive psychology with Jennifer Chevins, who is a professor at Ohio State University. And it's great fun to write about everything positive in life. And of course, people think the word positive psychology, and they think it's all about positive thinking and happiness. Right. But in fact, positive psychology is anything that is a strength about human nature. So, for instance, what I was just talking about a minute ago, about judicious amounts of anger being helpful in our lives. Why is it that I know that research study I just told you about? Well, it's because it's in our positive psychology book. Because actually anger in small amounts can be positive. So it really is about anything that's positive in our lives. And I think the thing that is most inspiring to me and really helps me get out of bed in the morning is just recognizing how amazingly resilient we are as human beings. Let me just hit you with one set of numbers. So the first one's going to sound horrible, and the second one's going to sound a little bit better. Okay. The horrible statistic is that something like 80% of us during our long lives will have a serious life-threatening trauma. And I'm not talking about horrible stuff like, divorce or job loss. These actually are not what I'm talking about, as horrible as those are. I'm talking about things like an accident that puts you in the ICU, sure, or being shot out in a war zone, or being assaulted and having your life threatened, or finding out that you have a terminal illness or a life-threatening disease. I mean, really, truly life-threatening traumas. 80% of us will have one of those at some point in our lives, and that's a number, the first time I heard it, that I didn't even want to believe. Right. And yet I'll assure you it's based on really solid epidemiological research in this country and around the world. And yet, and here's the amazing statistic, that only about 17% of people who encounter one of these horrible traumas end up with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Now, I'm not in any way minimizing PTSD, right? I mean, PTSD is life-changing. The nightmares, the flashbacks. It's a horrible thing to have, and people who have PTSD deserve really excellent care. So I'm in no way minimizing their situation. However, think about what that means. It means that 80-some% of us who experience a terrible trauma, we're resilient. We find a way to bounce back, to move forward in our lives. That's an amazing statement about the human spirit, that even when we go through awful stuff, we somehow, after a period of turmoil that's unavoidable, move forward in our lives. And boy, that gives me a lot of hope, particularly in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis, that we will be able together to find a way forward. That's the most surprising and I think inspiring thing to me in our book.
Awesome. Well, Dave, we're getting to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you, before I ask you the final question of the afternoon, is there something I should have asked but haven't yet asked, or that you would have liked me to have asked but I haven't yet asked?
Oh, it's a great question, and no, I think you've asked a lot of really perceptive questions, and I'm happy you did, because I think so often when we think about psychology, right, we think about the negative side of psychology. What causes people to be depressed? What causes people to be anxious? What causes people to be angry? And I think one of the things that I love about the questions you've asked is that we've explored what causes people to be hopeful, and what causes people to be forgiving, and what causes people to be happy and resilient. And again, not to dismiss or belittle in any way people who suffer from lots of negative feelings and issues and problems in their lives. But I think it's also good to make sure we understand how we all can sort of raise our quotient of strengths and positives in our lives. I think that's an important issue as well.
That's awesome. My final question is this. If you were a wizard and you were able to empower the world with just one practice that would perhaps make the individual happy, and perhaps even the society in which they live happier, based on the research, what might that skill be?
I'm going to go with forgiveness, and I'm going to add to that forgiveness and hope are almost the same thing, because if you think about it, forgiveness is that idea of realizing that you cannot change the past, but what you can change is the future, right? And what is grounded hope? Grounded hope is realizing that you need to ground yourself and accept what you cannot change, and turn your sights towards goals in the future and building a better future for yourself. So in my mind, they're highly yoked together. And I think that if we all could find ways of being more forgiving and more loving and more hopeful in our lives, wouldn't only be better for us, I think it would be better for our whole world.
Dave, such wise words. I wish you all the best on the publication of your book. I cannot wait to check it out. I remember Chris Peterson's book on positive psychology, and I just know that your contribution to the field will be phenomenal. And I'm just so grateful for your friendship and to have you as a colleague, and that you were able to share your wisdom with our listeners.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. To listen to other great episodes or to get more information about today's episode, please visit me at my website, dradamdorsey.com. That's DradamDorsay.com, and click the Super Psyched podcast link.